crush our intentions on one side, however much it may hurt. So God disciplines those He loves, and if you're not lining up where you're supposed to be, because He's a good Father, He will correct you. The purpose for which the missionary or the Christian is created is that he may be God's servant. We are saved to serve. One in whom God is glorified. When once we realize that through the salvation of Jesus Christ we are made perfectly fit for God, we shall understand why Jesus Christ is so ruthless in His demands. He demands absolute rectitude, that's righteousness, from the servants we would call holiness, because He has put into them the very nature of God. And then Oswald closes that devotion with this: beware lest you forget God's purpose for your life. Beware lest you hide your talent in the ground and don't use it, in other words. And it reminds me too, there's a phrase in 1 Corinthians 6. It comes out of verses 19 and 20. It's not the whole the verses in their entirety, but the phrase is this: you are not your own. You were bought with a price. So whatever we do in this life as a Christian, it has to be, dying to, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God. And that was actually our holiness text from Sunday school hour for the kids this morning. But so I'm saying all that to say this: God, it's really simple when you think Jesus is coming back. We have to be ready for His appearing. To be ready for His appearing, we have to be fulfilling our calling. Our calling is according to how He distributes it. He's going to call you according to how He calls you. It's like, I remember after that revival, when 5 of us were called out of the Tiffin Church to be preachers, we had a homecoming preacher. The preacher who was the preacher of the church when I was a kid, he came to do the homecoming services. He directed some of his comments to those of us who had been called. And he said, the best advice that I could give you as a young up-and-coming preacher is this: you preach the way God's given you to preach. That's right. In other words, you're not going to be me. You're not going to be a Lane Pettit. You're not going to be Billy Graham. You be who God's called you to be. Exactly. You take the talents that God has given you, and you run with it. That's right. And that's when God will increase it and do with it what He wants to do. That's right. It's just on us to be obedient and follow His leading. And speaking of the predestination aspect of it, and I know Diane had kind of asked a question one time, maybe a couple of weeks ago, about and I think she was asking about Chris, because she knows that Chris has a call, and she knows that he's not fulfilling that right now. But because it's God's calling, I don't think God will let up until that calling is fulfilled. And I think about myself in that regard. From the time I was a small kid, I didn't realize in the moment, but in retrospect and looking back, I can see moments in my life that coming up when it's because God had this destiny planned out for me that kept me, in essence kept me. And I think I may have shared this story before, but I remember I was in kindergarten and I was just learning how to ride my bike. I got my bike, it was a little too big for me, my feet couldn't quite reach the pedals. And I was out, but I could ride it, I just couldn't stop real good because my feet would fall. Anyway, I was going up, so I was in the yard going out our driveway, and and my feet slipped off the pedals, and I couldn't stop. And so instead of, I was hanging on, didn't want to fall off. Well, there's a car coming, and I'm rolling out to the road, and this car ain't stopping, and I'm not stopping, and so just as I'm about to hit him, or they're about to hit me, the bicycle stops dead in its tracks. So the car, and I look down, because I remember looking down and my feet are hanging off the pedals, but I'm stopped for no apparent reason.
Praise the Lord.
And I look, and this lady sitting, some little old lady with the big sunglasses, this big, taking her whole face. The car goes by and she's watching me the whole way. And once the car gets by, and then all of a sudden the bicycle rolls. I roll up, I was like, I remember, so I think I jumped off the bike and pushed it back to the house at that point. But I remember hollering at my mom. I was like, Mama, an angel just saved me. I knew enough that, I knew that I didn't stop myself, and I knew it was supernatural intervention. I didn't, anyway. But it's because before God formed me in the womb, He called me. He had a plan and a purpose. And I can think through the years when I grew up in the church. I was saved at 5 years old, and I realized I called at 12, but I denied it the same instant that I realized that I had a calling. And from 12 years old on, I knew that I was there was something more for my life, but I just wouldn't go through with it. And, that got into my high school years and on into college, and I just wasn't living for the Lord, but that calling was still in my life. And I can think too, there's no reason for me to still be here other than God's divine intervention, because He had that predestined for me, I believe. There's stories from, I can think of one in particular. I was at a party, and I won't go into all the details, but I got high, I got extremely high, and during the process of that, I literally felt like I was dying. My heart started doing some crazy palpitation stuff, and I grabbed my buddy who was in, just as bad shape as me, and I grabbed him up and I said, "Dude, I'm dying. He's like, "You're crazy, you're just high, shut up." But anyway, so I went to this place, and it kind of reminded me of Chris's vision the other day of what the Lord gave him for hell. But I went, maybe not exactly, but you'll hear what I'm talking about when I get to it. But I went to this dark, dank place where it was rocky, and it was all gray. And I just came and lit there, and there were 3 demons dancing around the fire, and they look at me once I land there and say, "Come with us, come with us." And they reach out to me. They're saying, "Come with us, come with us." And I'm mortified, because I'm like, I'm about to die and I'm going to hell. And they finally get hold of me, and once they grab me, all of a sudden I'm falling down a pit, and it's just this dark pit, no light whatsoever. And as I'm falling, I can feel the claws of these demons literally reaching in and pulling my soul out from within me. But I was like, "Lord," I was like, "Jesus, you got to save me." And the moment I said, "Jesus, you got to save me," I came to, and I'm standing in this house in the kitchen by the refrigerator. And anyway, I was like, that should have been enough to scare me straight, but it wasn't. But nonetheless, God had a plan and a purpose for it. There's two more episodes where I know it's only God that, preserved me. There's another time I was drinking and smoking stuff I shouldn't have been smoking, and I'm on the way home. And, when you get in that state, you really don't care how fast you drive. Sometimes you think it's funny the faster you go. But as I'm going home, I don't know how fast, but fast enough where if I'd have not went in the curve, I would have. There was this big curve after you pass the river going toward Mom and Daddy's house, and actually at this point I'm starting to black out, but all of a sudden I see a lady standing on the road waving her hands like this. I said, "Oh wait, that's the curve." And so I go around the curve instead of going straight, which would have led off. I would have hit a ditch about 10 foot tall. Or anyway. And so I dismissed it. I said, I must have been hallucinating or something. So because I was smoking weed, but my buddies had laced it with opium. So that'll do some. But anyway, so the next day I'm like, okay, so I just that road sign that's right there. I just saw that road sign. Well, I went back the next day to look and see. And where that road sign was, where I saw the angel waving me clear. But that wasn't enough to scare me straight. It's just, like I said, it's just God's predestination, I believe. He had a plan for me, even though I wasn't living up to the call. Well, and you've heard me say before too. I tried to kill myself one time, or I thought about it, highly contemplated it. On purpose went to Walmart and bought hollow point bullets because all I had was full metal jackets, and I didn't want to have a clean shot through and through. So I had planned this out enough to, premeditated murder is what it would be. But anyway, I get to and I write out my suicide letter and all this stupid stuff. And I was sitting in my room, and I remember pulling the slide back on the gun. I'm like, well, I'll put it between my eyes because, between the eyes you're pretty much not going to survive. I remember, put that cold steel of that gun there. But I stopped. I was like, well. And anyway, I went breaking the gun down. I was going to unload it. And here's the kicker: when I went to unload the gun, when I slid the slide back, it never changed the bullet. So even if I had pulled the trigger, God had already intervened on my behalf. I mean, and that, that kind of stopped me in my tracks. Maybe there's, but when I was starting to get a little light on it, the devil right there. Oh, just reload. It's just like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's like, that'd be stupid because, But even that wasn't enough. I still drank and drove and all that kind of nonsense. But then, God saw fit to bring Roseanne into my life. And, we weren't living for the Lord, either one of us. But we did have enough sense to know that, to ask God about each other. And I remember the night that, I realized that I had feelings for her, and I realized I loved her. And so the night I was going to tell her that, you probably heard me tell this story too. We were working at UPS and working out afterwards. I told her I wanted to meet her at the gym and talk about something. But as I'm sitting in this gym, on the ladies' side, I had a couch at the front door. And so I was sitting at that couch waiting for her to get done in the gym. And I was like, well, I'm either going to tear all over or I'm fixing around the door and leave. I was to that point. But even through the midst of all the fog of sin I was in, I heard God say, and this he said, you might better hang on to this. God's got a way of speaking to you in terms you can. He speaks to you in ways you understand. Yep. So long story short, I said, okay, Lord, and told Roseanne I loved her that night. And of course, we still had to get right with God because we got back in church. We got pregnant with John Lee. We got back in church. It's Primitive Baptist Church. Which sitting in those services, God was working with us. I started hearing stuff. I'm like, they don't preach the way I heard preaching when I was a kid. I don't understand this. Their predestination, the predestination I'm talking to you about tonight, their predestination was God had an elect that He had pre-chosen. Anyway, but I remember sitting in church and God said, you should understand the difference between this doctrine and what He didn't say doctrine, because I wasn't on. He said you should be able to explain the difference between how you grew up and the preaching you hear and what you hear now on a more than lay level. So anyway, then we got back in Church Nazarene, and then God just happened to bring Elaine through town one time. She preached one service one Sunday morning that really, I think it struck Roseanne more than it did me because, I'd heard that kind of preaching before as a kid. But she never heard, because I think you used the illustration of somebody being caught in a car. And she had a picture of her best friend from high school. Anyway. So that shook her to the core, and she actually answered her calling, even though we still didn't get right till that revival in December. But that's when that's when I realized that's when it all came full circle, because it's when I realized that God did have a calling. That calling I denied when I was 12 years old. All through the years, God had preserved me. But there came a moment when, in that revival, when I actually finally went forward, I got, the Lord, Roseanne already went forward. She'd asked to be sanctified. And that last service, the Lord said, and He firmly set forward, but I'll say it again, you can either go now, or you don't have to worry about me bothering and asking you again. That's how God put it to me. And so I went forward and asked Him to sanctify me. And, and that fulfilled, that second work of grace of being entire, because I didn't just go from sinner to up there and get sanctified. It was actually previously in a revival that I recommitted my life to the Lord. Where if you want to re-saved, I don't like you term it that way, but I repented of my backsliding, and I was now where I needed to be as a justified person, not being sanctified. Anyway, so I got sanctified, and the Lord continues to, and this is where, and I don't discount all of the 5 points of Calvinism. There is a preservation of the saints. To this day, it was after Maggie was born. I've got another episode. After Maggie was born, she was born in July. This was probably September. I remember, we were going through classes at this point in time for ministry, and one of the guys in class was somebody talking about having visions and all this kind of stuff. I don't know visions, and it's like the Lord reminded me of everything I shared with you tonight. He needs a vision when you've had all this happen in your life. But then it's like, but I remember reading too about Elijah's Mount Carmel experience. I said, Lord, I'd like to have a Mount Carmel experience. You gotta be careful what you ask for. Anyway, we had a September, as we've already seen, is tropical storm season. We actually had a hurricane blow through in South Georgia. I think it was still Category 1 once it went through. Anyway, working with Dad, there was debris in all these yards. This one particular yard, they had a 12-2 Romex wire going out to a security light. Well, I'd set this wire on the chain link fence. I just laid it up there to get out of the way. And I think we went back the next week or next day or something. Anyway, that wire evidently had a nick in it, and it energized that chain link fence, which I wasn't aware of until we had some guys working with us, and they left the gate open. It didn't energize until the gate was open, so I went to close it. So I grabbed the gate on one side and the post on the other, and I completed the circuit. And so I was starting to get electrocuted because it's just 110 volts, but 110 drawing you to it. It was 220 would have knocked me off. But anyway, 110 tensed my muscles and I couldn't let go. And I was like, "Oh Lord, I can't let go." So I'm sitting here and I can't, and my teeth are chattering. I mean, it's literally shocking, not electrocuting, but shocking me to death. Anyway, so I remember I'm sitting there and it's 30. I don't know how long it was, but it's long enough for us. I'm starting to go black, and I remember I was able to get a foot up on the post, but evidently I had a hole in the bottom of my shoe, and my foot stuck to the post. So I'm like, both hands and a foot, and I'm blacking out, and I see everything's going black in my mind's eye. And I remember, and then it goes black, and then all of a sudden I start seeing light. It's like, I'm cognizant enough to know, wait a minute, everything's going black, and I'm starting to see the light. I'm like, Lord. Yeah, and I thought about it, I was like, well, Maggie's just brand new. I was like, I don't want to die yet. I was like, Lord, I can't do this. I can't free myself. But as soon as I cried out to the Lord in that sense, I was on the ground. So evidently he knocked me off and set up a yes because I didn't do it. But anyway, I dislocated my shoulder again, evidently they took me to the hospital and they run an EKG on me, and evidently something they never did tell me, but something must have showed up or they admitted me overnight. But anyway, so then I sit in the bed that night. The Lord said, "Well, now you got your mountaintop experience if you want to look at it that way." But God's got a plan and a purpose for us. He's got a destiny planned out. The question is, are we going to get on board with it or not? And that's the thing. It's not over till it's over. Ben alluded to that. Just because I got saved or I got sanctified December 8, 2002, that ain't enough to get by. What's the date? 9/22/19. It's got to be an up-to-date salvific experience. I mean, we've got this. It is a moment of salvation. It is, there is a moment when you become a saint, but that's not the same as where you stand in your sainthood today. There's more to gain, more heights to climb. It's like we went to Colorado Springs, NBC, when they still had the campus there on Colorado Springs. It's all online now. But I remember Colorado Springs, Nazarene Bible College campus is at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, Pikes Peak. And the thing is, I think we rode up to the top of Pikes Peak in the rental car. Anyway, but that's the thing. We rode up to the Pikes Peak, and once you get to that peak, you can see all the rest of the Rocky Mountains. There's still mountains to conquer. There's still, it's just like, you have this mountaintop experience of entire sanctification, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in Christ Jesus. You know, there's still victories to be won. There's still valleys to go through. But what are we going to do with what He's given us? You know, that's the real question. How are we going to be used to be ready for a second coming? How many others are we going to? We know, you know, going back to that passage, we know that our Master's a hard taskmaster, so to speak, because he gathers where He hasn't sown. You know, He's put us into His harvest field to bring those in. You know, there's other sheep. You know, there's a passage that speaks of other sheep, not of this pasture. So, but we're called to bring them into the fold. And so, you know, what are we going to do with that? I think that's the question God has for us. What are you going to do with your talents? What are you going to do with what God has given you? Because there's a whole world that needs the experience that we have. We've got to make sure that our experience stays current and up to date, so we're ready to reach the lost and found.
I can't help but think, as you first started speaking of how you were saved from the first angel, what's kept going through my mind is for such a time as this. And I think that's true of all of us. I think God gathered all of us here for such a time as this, and coordinated everything for such a time as this, for what He's going to do.
I never thought I'd get back up here during the altar time, but if you can stay with me, I didn't want to have those things where, He's trying to outdo me and we're doing the altar call at the same time, and I'm trying to do louder than He is, like we're having our own little, thing over here. But the thought that he brought up through the whole thing to me in the summation from the scripture is make your calling and election sure. God's really going to give you an entrance into heaven if you make sure. You see what I mean? And then the other thing, I forgot it. I wanted to bring up the one thought that made me even go this direction this week was a sobering thought. I was talking to him in the car praying or something, and I said, man, we read these stories by Mary Shelley and all these others about hell, Bill Weiss, and they're not in their final hell. I mean, we are impressed with what he went through, and that is not the final hell. The final hell, they're still awaiting. They don't even understand that they're even there right now, and they're suffering, but that's not the final hell. And so it shows you that, this process of what we do with what He's given us is damning or it's saving.
That's right.
And that's what Pastor Lee, and I'm glad he brought all that hard stuff with him.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm glad he ended on hell. I thought he was going to go, somewhere off in the middle there, and that's going to go through. I'm glad he went through all this stuff. Let's pray. Let's all pray. Father, I thank You for Reverend Lee. I thank You for this. Lord, I've wanted to do that for years. I wanted to preach with another holiness pastor or evangelist, Lord, in the middle of a revival meeting. That's how they do it sometimes in the South, but I've heard about it for years. But I've never done it, and I know Lee has with his wife and other things. But Lord, I thank You for the victory tonight. I know that You're here. I know You're speaking to us. Lord, those words and those testimonies are very deep and hard to share. But Lord, it's the sobering reality of hell, the sobering reality of heaven, and our call. And Lord, through it all, I hope everybody heard hope. Because what He was talking about was God was making sure that Lee made it. Not only that he came to the point of being saved and being sanctified, which is awesome, but that he kept on going. He's being preserved to this day. Lord, we don't even know how many times and how many ways, just like as when he was a child. And Lord, we want to take our talent and we want to increase it. And Lord, we want to increase other people's talent around us. Those that don't think they have a day of salvation or already given up and listen to the devil's lies, we can intervene. Lord, we can cry out for them that they'd have a new day. That You would afford them another opportunity, that they would come in here somehow, that You'd break their stubbornness and their unbelief. And Lord, what are we doing? That's all I'm saying. What are we doing about this?
That's right.
What are we doing? Lord, I pray we're doing everything. Calvin in his Calvinistic way, he says, the worst you can act as bad examples. But he says, what are you doing? That's his whole message at the end of every sermon. He says, what's your point? What are you doing after Christ saved you? Are you doing anything? And Lord, we need to have 100% passion. The devil wants us to be completely gone, away from You. And that's what the scripture said we were before we were saved, completely gone. And Lord, instead, You want us to love the Lord our God with all our heart and be full of You. Lord, it's the options. I pray that we go 100% forward with that idea we are going to work on our salvation with fear and trembling.
Yes.
Lord, thank you for what you've done in these. Lord, thank you for what you've done. Lord, let this thing sink deep. I pray to say in Jesus' name.